for hosting me, to Fanar for putting this together. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's my second time to Singapore in about a year, and I figured I had a free day today and I'd want to talk about some of this. So I'm very fortunate to be here, and I'm grateful to all of you for attending as well. To give you a bit of background, there's been a lot of discussion about the rise of millenarianism, particularly in the Islamic world as we've seen it in the Levant, in Syria and Iraq. And the debate in the UK, at least, and more generally in the West, has seemed to be quite polarized between this idea that it's got nothing to do with Islam and that what you're seeing is a complete aberration. And then on the other hand, people who say this is all from Islam and that this is true and authentic Islam, and that what you're seeing in this part of the world is what Muslims are really like, and that Islam and the West, and Islam and democracy, Islam and modernity can never mix. And so there are a lot of books that have looked at the sort of, you could say, the organizational nature of terrorism and terrorist groups, and when did bin Laden meet this guy, and when did these meetings happen, and so on and so forth. And I wanted to pull the sort of layers back in a slightly different way, and I wanted to look at the theology involved here. I've been very interested in Islamic theology for a long time, and so I wanted to kind of show the debates within the movement. And so when I started, I was really sort of saying, yeah, I want to study like jihadi ideology and so on and so forth. And increasingly I realized this was a dialogue within a particular tradition of Islam, a tradition known as Salafism, which I'll come on to talk about in a bit more detail. But it was really a dialogue within this one particular tradition. To simplify it a touch, I mean, there's clearly lots of other movements as well that don't come from the Salafi spectrum, some of whom are violent, some of whom are politicized, like the Muslim Brotherhood, which is clearly not a Salafi movement. But nonetheless, the most interesting areas of debate I saw existed within the Salafi sort of aspect or tent of Islam. And so I began to drill down into some of that and to look at debates of authenticity and legitimacy within the movement. So it's worth saying at the start that Salafism is one form of Islamic practice that is it's Sunni practice of Islam, and it's really what I call a kind of it's a literalist regressive movement. It believes in progression through regression. And so what the Salafis are trying to do is to go back to the era, as they see it, of authentic Islam of the first three generations. So that would be the companions of the Prophet Mohamed, the next generation, their kids, and then the kids' kids. And those first three generations are taken to be the sort of most pure era, known as the Salafi-Salihin, the pious predecessors. And these guys say, okay, we can't be the Prophet, right? We can't be him, so we can be like the companions. We can try to emulate them and to live the lives that they led and to reestablish the practices that they led. And so by going back to that, we progress. We lead the good Muslim life in a way. It's the philosophy of how do I lead the good life. And so they want this regressive element by going back to that phase. Now it's worth saying that we hear a lot about Salafism. By the way, the slides just have pictures on it to illustrate. There's no text at any stage. But it's worth saying that Salafism you could really break down into three broad categories. I actually take it slightly further in my book and argue that there's sort of 6 categories. But in essence, the 3 main categories have been well established, and I think they're important and they're instructive in the first instance, at least in this context, is that the vast majority of Salafis are quietists. They're people who don't believe in radical political change, they don't believe in radical social change. They're concerned primarily with themselves and with their families. And they spend lots of time debating issues of personal law, like how long should your beard be exactly? Should your trousers definitely be above your ankle? Is it a terrible thing if they're not? And these kinds of things. And Salafis, particularly in the West, I always say they're the sort of people I suppose you'd see who are clearly sort of identifiably Muslim. That insofar as the men do tend to have the long beards, and the women tend to wear the niqab, the face veil. And so they sort of stand out as sort of very obviously, clearly, visibly Muslim. But I keep reassuring people that on the whole, Salafis don't believe in social change. As I say, it's primarily a concern of themselves. And then you have a second kind of category of Salafis, which are the politicos. And these politico Salafis don't really tend to operate so much in the West. They're primarily concentrated in the Gulf, particularly in Saudi Arabia, where I think they are very fascinating in terms of what they do. And what the politicos have done, they've really matured, you could say. They've been around in the 1990s and became quite prominent after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and the United States established military bases in the Saudi kingdom at that time. And so these politicos emerged quite dramatically. But they've had a sort of maturing over time, partly helped by long periods incarcerated where they could reconsider some of their thoughts. But I found the writings of one particular guy, Salman al-Awda, particularly enlightening in the period that immediately sort of followed the Arab uprisings that took place first, of course, in North Africa in 2011. And so, of course, all the Arab states were worried, will this come to us? What will happen to our own societies? And so on. And you could say the sort of quietist, the state Salafis, the governmental clerics in Saudi Arabia were quick to say, it's forbidden for you to come out and protest. They're haram, essentially, protests, and you should not engage in this. But what the politicos did was even more interesting, was they wrote to the king in openly sort of saying, look, you have to understand that people have grievances. You have to understand that people are demanding certain rights that you have to give them. So we want a truly independent judiciary. We want a lack of corruption, particularly amongst the police and within the civil service. We want sort of certain things. And so they're saying, these are things you have to give people. You can't hold back the tide forever because societies, over time, pressure builds and the dam bursts. But at the same time, they said to the people, look, there's a responsibility on you not to come out and protest. You should maintain the social order and you should place a premium on social order. And it's worth saying, and it always seems sort of bizarre to say it, given what we see, again, particularly in the Middle East, but more generally in the Muslim world, is that Islam places quite a strong premium on the maintenance of social order and social stability. Doesn't really want social disorder or strife. So they were saying, look, understand that there are these rules here about maintaining social order. Yes, the government has to give concessions and to reform, but at the same time, we need you to also respect the bargain. Don't come out and cause disorder. It will not achieve the desired ends and aims. So it's saying to both sides, look, you each have rights and you each have responsibilities. And each side needs to come out. And so the political Salafis, as I say, they operate in very interesting ways. And they're primarily sort of pronounced now in the Gulf, and you've seen this maturing of their agenda in that region. There's a good book by Stéphane Lacroix where he looks at some of the early emergence of these sort of political movements, again, particularly in Saudi Arabia. So you have the quietists, you have the politicos or the activists, and then you have the jihadis. And the jihadis, of course, operate in a rejectionist way. For them, the very existence of these regimes is fundamentally irreconcilable with Islam as they see it. It's irreconcilable with the established order and structure. All internationalist bodies, so bodies like the UN or the International Criminal Court, all of these things are kufr as far as they're concerned. They are instruments of non-believers. They are used to subjugate Islam in political ways. And they fundamentally believe in rejecting and overturning all of this from the root. So they don't believe reform is possible. They say, by definition, inherently these things are corrupt and they are un-Islamic and they must be challenged and fought. And so it's this last category of Salafism that I was particularly interested in. And as I say, to try and understand and to look at some of what they were doing, some of what they were arguing, and how they were constructing this idea. Before I do that, I always forget this earlier on, and I was mentioning it now. People in the lexicon, again, in the West in particular, I'm sure it happens here as well, they sort of interchangeably use terms like Salafi and Wahhabi. It's all the Wahhabis are dominant in IS, or these people are all fighting stuff. If you think, this is the best way to think about it, if you think of Salafism as the philosophy, like I was talking about earlier, the philosophy of the good Muslim life. So this is how I can lead the good life as a Muslim, this is how I can achieve authenticity. Then Abdul Wahhab was one person who envisaged a method to achieve that end. So not all Salafis are Wahhabis. It's definitely the case that most Salafis are. It's the best known, it's the, you could say, most proliferated method, manhaj, for the realization of the philosophical end game. But it's not strictly true to confuse these two terms or to use them interchangeably. So when I came to look at the jihadis, I thought, okay, what do we do here? How do I write a book around these guys? How do I try and explain what they're doing? And so I said, there are 5 essential and defining features of the Salafi jihadi movement. There are essentially 5 things you have to believe in to be a Salafi jihadi. And I took out basic concepts that exist that are sort of important to all Salafis. So, like the concept of bid'ah, a sort of heretical or sinful innovation in Islam. Was originally I was going to include it, then I decided not to, because as I say, it's an important issue to all Muslims and to Salafis as well. So it wasn't something that was unique to the group. So the 5 ideas I held that were the sort of defining essential characteristics of the movement are jihad, clearly, obviously, the concept of takfir, al-wala wal-bara, Tawheed, and hakimiyya. And I'll explain each one of these and what I saw that was interesting about them. So the concept of jihad, to start with, is clearly a well-known term. It's entered the dictionary in probably every culture right now. And the term itself is, of course, highly contested, even amongst Muslims, as to what does jihad mean. And so what I did in my study, because I'm also a Muslim, I have to try and be dispassionate and be objective. I said, I'm not going to make value judgments. So I'm not going to say this is good theology or bad theology or this, because that puts me in the realm of polemic. And so I said, I'm going to look at this from their eyes, and I'm going to give their definitions and their understandings with reference to their movement. So whatever they say is what we'll adopt. So I said, look, yes, there's a lot of discussion. Jihad means all these different things. It can mean to struggle, and people have tried to interpret this idea in very broad ways and so on and so forth. But for the jihadi movement themselves, they said, yeah, we accept the linguistic definition of jihad, but there's also a legal meaning. There's a shari'i meaning of jihad. And the legal meaning is to fight. It's always to fight. The legal definition is killing and warfare. Okay, so we adopt that. And then from there, they built up a series of ideas. So they said, look, jihad is a ritualistic act, just like any other ritual obligation upon you. So as a Muslim, you have to pray 5 times a day, you have to fast, you have to do this. You also have to fight jihad. And jihad sits within the spectrum of obligations and duties, just like any other obligation and duty. So it's sort of normalizing the act and bringing it into the fray of everyday activity, as you would see in many ways. They also, very importantly, developed this idea. They said, look, jihad is 2 types. There's an offensive jihad and a defensive jihad. But how does a group like al-Qaeda, for example, then validate attacks against civilian populations, against government institutions, both in the Muslim world and in the West? And what they said is all of this is a defensive measure. So it built chains of what I call sort of connectivity or chains of causation, so that they would say, we are being oppressed in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia or in Jordan, Yemen, wherever it may be. And our regimes are being sponsored by and backed by the West. So the West is the real culprit in all of this. And so we need to attack this guy in order to relieve and alleviate the suffering we're experiencing here. So they build this chain of causation back to the West. They also built this idea of vicarious liability. And what they mean by that is that like Fanar can be responsible for something that I'm doing. And they say that in this context. They say in the West, you've elected your governments. There is a contractual relationship between the people and the rulers. So the fact that these governments perpetrate crimes, they do so in your name. Therefore, you will be held responsible for their crimes or excesses as defined by the Salafi-Jihadi movement. And so that, again, helped them to validate a number of things, or you could say the targeting of civilians in as I say, both Muslim and non-Muslim countries. But then the next idea, I suppose, becomes more important in this concept, the notion of takfir, or excommunication, essentially rendering other Muslims to be non-Muslims. And you've seen this being used very dynamically by first al-Qaeda in 2003 in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq to license the sectarian conflicts against the Shia. And you see it again very prominently today being used both in Syria and Iraq by not just Islamic State, but also groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, which has become Jabhat Fath al-Sham, and other groups as well, in order to fight Shias and Alawis and so on. So it licenses intra-Muslim fighting. That's the key. That's the real sort of point of this, is that takfir is used to license intra-Muslim fighting, or to intra-Muslim warfare. And so, very importantly, that allows them to wage some of this conflict. And they use some very interesting ideas, again, around this, modernizing it, bringing it up to speed in order to make the case. So one of the things that they were saying was that, for example, can you make generalized takfir, or do you have to go to each individual and establish whether that individual has truly understood the implications? Because takfir as a notion has a lot of barriers to it. There are lots of impediments before you should pronounce it. And it's a very weighty thing. So for the jihad movement to use this, particularly in the context of indiscriminately letting off bombs, there was a process through which they had to go through. And there was a series of interesting booklets that al-Qaeda released from 2003 in order to try and validate and justify and explain some of what it was doing in that regard. And so what they said, for example, was, which is quite interesting, they didn't, traditionally they say, scholars who challenge them, they've got it wrong, and that they didn't really understand things properly. With this concept, they tended to say, look, the existing scholarship is correct, but there are certain challenges of fighting jihad in the modern age that make that scholarship irrelevant. It's no longer fitting. So it wasn't that it was wrong, that it had become irrelevant. So there's a particular book, Fi Jihad al-Mu'asir, the concept of human shields in the modern warfare, or in the modern jihad. And in that concept, they really talked a lot about saying, look, the way modern weaponry works, the way things are, we couldn't fight today if we didn't do this. And the obligations of fighting jihad, the premium of fighting jihad, outweighs the barriers or the impediments to some of these concepts. Therefore, we have to prioritize this using another principle of the lesser of two evils, which some use as a jurisprudential thing to try and work out when two obligations may conflict, which one takes priority or precedence. So clearly they weighted these ideas in their favor in order to justify them. The similar thing came about with the concept of wala wal bara, and that's a concept really, it doesn't have a clean or literal English translation, but it essentially sort of comes down to the idea of love and hate for the sake of God, or loyalty and disavowal for the sake of God. And so what's very interesting about this concept is that, again, it traditionally emerged as a point of personal law for the early Muslims, about distinguishing themselves in terms of their rituals. So you have Eid, which is a different festival to non-Muslims. And so you were sort of distinguishing yourself in personal conduct, personal behavior, personal events and celebrations and these types of things. And then there's some very good scholarship, it wasn't mine, but there's some very good scholarship that came out by a Dutch academic, Joas Wagemakers, who showed that the first time this idea really began to be used politically and was starting to be deployed in political context and used for political mobilizations came about with the rise and fall of the first and second Saudi states. And that when the infighting took place there, at various times different groups and tribes were using the concept of al-wala wal-bara as states, so mini-statelets, to say, you owe us your allegiance, don't work with our enemies to fight us. And they were trying to, as I say, use the idea at that stage as a politicized tool of achieving support and winning support from others to varying degrees of success. And what was significant was that in the post 9/11 climate, al-Qaeda becomes a group, the first group really, to try and use the idea to win support for itself as a non-state actor. But to say, look, all Muslims owe us loyalty and allegiance through the prism of wala wal bara, and you should make bara from the West. You should disavow the West and give us your wala. You owe us support. It's a religious obligation on you to support us. So it's the first time you have a sub-state actor, a non-state actor, demanding loyalty and allegiance in this way, and requiring it as a tool, again, of sort of great utility for it in terms of mobilization in order to help them in their campaign. So again, a very important idea, and it helps build, again, this notion of an in-group and an out-group, right? So the in-group is the Muslims, and the out-group is non-Muslims, and in this mechanized, militarized fashion. And couple that with the notion of takfir, as I say, which again helps you delineate the boundaries of what that in-group is. So to be part of the in-group, here is the definition, and here is the boundary. Anyone steps outside of it has now left the in-group and falls into the category of people who are owed a bara. So it's very important, both of these ideas, when they're used together, and you frequently find them being discussed together in a lot of the literature that is used in order to try and push that. The fourth idea that was really important is that of Tawheed. And this one I'll explain to you in the sense that every Muslim believes in Tawheed. Tawheed is the definition of Islam itself. It's monotheism. And so you can't be a Muslim without believing in Tawheed. It's the first and most fundamental basic point. So why include it in a book on the jihadis and on Salafis? The reason I put it in was that they did some very interesting work around this, and the point was, again, to show what they've done unique to these ideas, because the concept of wala wal bara exists in normative Islam. The concept of takfir exists. Jihad exists. These are ideas. I want to show the non-normative understandings that the Salafi jihadi movement has about these, and the non-normative theology that they're bringing through. So with the concept of Tawheed, which, as I say, all Muslims believe in, and it's not a radical concept, nonetheless, their interpretation was very, very interesting. And it really comes back to some work that I think first started with Abdullah Azzam and then has been continued on by others. But Azzam took this idea and said, look, when you understand Tawheed, Muslims believe there are multiple ways you have to realize Tawheed, and you owe God your obedience and your worship, and go in all kinds of different ways. So yeah, you fast, but fasting doesn't negate the need for prayer. You also have to pray. And that doesn't negate the need for giving charity. You also have to give charity. But those don't negate the need to make pilgrimage. So there are all these different things you have to do. And there are these different ways to realize the Tawheed of Allah. And so he said, look, when you look at the various different obligations and understandings that Islam has given you, you have to find different ways to achieve them. So Muslims believe in this idea that the time of your birth was fixed. It was one of the first thing that God did in creation was to tell the tablet to write, and so the pen to write on the tablet. So he says, the time of your birth is fixed, but so is the time of your death. And that's in the Quran, that you can't move the date and the time either way. It's completely fixed. So Abdullah Azzam says, how do you demonstrate to Allah that you believe in this concept? It's not a theoretical idea. So how can you practically demonstrate that you believe in this notion that your death is in the hands of Allah and only Allah? He says, well, you will die on the streets of London if that's the time that's set for you. So why not come to the battlefield, to jihad, to demonstrate? Because only when your life is being threatened, when bullets are flying past you and shells are blowing up next to you, can you truly demonstrate that you believe in this idea? That's how you show Allah that you've fully understood the concept. And so when you think about it, it's a really radical point, because what it says is, no Muslim can truly achieve Tawheed, can truly satisfy the conditions of Tawheed, unless they come and fight jihad. Unless they come and essentially risk their life and put it on the line and say, if I'm going to die, it would happen anyway. And if not, it wouldn't matter. And he tells this long story of one of his companions who was supposedly always seeking martyrdom and was taking crazy risks, and it never happened. And these were the old days, when a lot of these guys used to go to the United States to fundraise for their jihad and then come back. And so he went to Florida on a fundraising tour and died in a convention center there. And so Abdullah Azzam said, look, he was out here fighting the Russians and their bombs were falling, and it wasn't his moment, and it had to happen as Allah had decreed it in an air-conditioned convention center somewhere in Florida. So for Azzam, that was like the moment he says he understood this concept in this way. And as I say, a very, very interesting and I say quite radically profound way of interpreting Tawheed. And so I put it in the book for that reason. Which leads quite nicely to the last of the 5 categories, which is of Hakimiyya, and it's essentially the idea of having Islamic governance. And this is an idea that's very broad, very broadly interpreted, and as I say, from groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, all the way through, or even lesser than them, like al-Nahda, and so on, all the way through to something like Islamic State, ISIS, Daesh, as you see them today in Syria and Iraq. And again, there is a lot of discussion around this idea, but it's also quite well established, and it's not just Salafi-Jihadis who believe in this concept. So it's interesting, they don't write about it quite so much. So you don't have a big book from Bin Laden or Zawahiri or Abu Yahya al-Libi or any of the sort of old figures who wrote a lot about all these other ideas. They don't write a lot about Hakimiyya or Khilafah, because the idea, I think, and I'm speculating, but I think the reason they don't feel the need to write about it is because they take it for granted. Like, they reference it in passing, like, yes, of course, that's the end point. But they don't feel the need to have a big discussion around it, because I think in their minds they feel like the idea has already achieved critical mass. It's sort of hit terminal velocity. Whereas if you are killing lots of Shia in 2003, 4, and 5 in Iraq, using the concept of takfir, a lot of people are saying, whoa, what's happening? And so you need to kind of try and explain and justify what you're doing. So they felt the need to emphasize some ideas, perhaps more than this one. What I thought was really interesting with the concept of Hakimiyya in sort of modern era and its popularization in the modern era is that whereas I felt a lot of the contemporary roots of the other 4 ideas lay principally with actors and events that emerged in the Arab Muslim world, particularly in the Gulf and to an extent in Egypt and Jordan and Algeria. The real genesis of this, I felt, again, in its revival, came from the Indian subcontinent. And this was a result of British imperialism in the region and Maududi's writings in particular, when the Muslim Indian community became quite prominent in the Free India movement. And a lot of Maududi's works were, of course, translated into Arabic and are known to have influenced Qutb quite profoundly. And then, of course, Qutb transposes and popularizes those ideas back into the Arab world, where they've taken root. So it's interesting that the genesis, and I say the sort of trajectory of this idea finds its roots in the political events of the Indian subcontinent, more so than the other ones, and it comes in. Again, there are various debates that sit around some of this, but there's a whole concept as well, again, which the Salafi-Jihadis use more than others, is the notion of Tawheed al-Hakimiyya. So again, they say one of the ways to realize the Tawheed of Allah is to have Hakimiyya and to have Islamic governance, and that this is a great sin to not have an Islamic state and so on. And again, there's interesting debates about whether the concept of Tawheed al-Hakimiyya is a bid'ah and it's a new innovation, or whether it's not. And I won't bore you with the intricacies of that debate. You can read about it in the book if you're very interested. But there is an interesting argument that takes place there. So with the basis of these 5 ideas, what also becomes very interesting is that you see there's 2 interesting things. One is that Islam doesn't have an established clergy. There's no sort of orthodox way by which one would become an imam and so on. I always say to people back at King's, if I taught you the requisite Arabic, you could lead Friday prayers this Friday, right? You just go and say the certain parts that are obligatory, and you can do it. So Islam has traditionally, and particularly again for Salafis, it's been very important that your sort of standing and credentials have come through scholarship and who you've trained under, and there's an emphasis on scholarship, and people talk about ijazas, who you have permission from, who your teachers were, and so on. And so I suppose, when I think about it, the famous scholar of hadith, Albani, if you were going to try and be the next guy who's going to be on that, you'd have to have the ijazah from Albani to talk about these things, and so on and so forth. So you build these chains of authenticity that are supposedly built up over years of scholarship, and so you establish authority in that way. What's very interesting is for the Salafi Jihadi movement, they don't tend to have really established scholars or particularly well-known scholars. So where does the authority come from? Authority comes from praxis. It comes from being on the battlefield. So if you look at it, and you probably all heard recently about the death of Adnani from IS, and when he got droned. And if you see the footage or the imagery of him, the most famous image so far that IS has used themselves when they've been eulogizing him is of him standing there with a sort of military vest on, filled with bullets and guns. And it's, look at the sheikh, right? Look at this warrior scholar who's on the front lines, who's on the battlefield. And what they really want you to do is to respect him and to assume he has authority by virtue of his battlefield experience. So again, when we look at images of Zarqawi and the famous images that came out of him from 2003, 4, and 5, there's one of him firing the machine gun in the desert, and the other one of him sitting around the map with others planning battles. So these are the things. So authority really comes from praxis within this movement. There's a sense that this is the thing from which one derives authenticity and status and authority within the movement. What's also very interesting, and I'll sort of wrap it up in the next 2-3 minutes, but I'll bring it more contemporary, is I felt that when I looked at the material, the sort of most prolific period, of course, of written material follows in the immediate aftermath of September the 11th, and it comes from al-Qaeda groupings who are trying to win support based on some of these ideas. And what's interesting when you read those books is two things. One is that al-Qaeda was very keen to try and posit itself within religious tradition. So I'm not saying they are a religious movement or that they have authenticity, but certainly what was important for them was to try and posit themselves within religious tradition. So they would try and build chains of continuity between themselves and their actions and their understandings and scholars from Islamic antiquity. So you see people like Ibn Taymiyyah referenced a lot and so on, right? So they would say, look, this is what happened before and this is what happened at other times, and here we are today. And they're building this chain to try and put themselves at the end of this. And they would cite all these previous scholars as well and their episodes and events to, again, try and give legitimacy to what they were doing, to say, well, when you put it in the modern context, like I say, old scholarship isn't necessarily incorrect, but it's slightly irrelevant. And so that they're trying to bring themselves up to the modern way in that sense. So it was a real attempt by them to publish a lot of material, to posit themselves within religious debate, and to try and have this moment where they could say, look, we really are the true guardians, representatives of Islam, and so forth. IS doesn't do that. Islamic State really has a real lack of in-depth scholarly material. And when you look at the IS documents that have come out, that have tended to be released, that have leaked out onto the internet, firstly, the more bulky literature that's come out is administrative documents. Right? It's about collecting zakat, it's about running the organization, it's about what their military commanders should be doing. It's not theologically grounded stuff. Then the small bits of scholarship that come out, they tend to be repackaged materials that already exist. So there's nothing new. So they might reissue a booklet, but it's already existed in the past. And so there's nothing that's really coming out that's unique from them. And I really thought that was quite interesting when they killed Mu'adh al-Qasasbeh. Mu'adh al-Qasasbeh was the Jordanian pilot who they burnt alive within the cage. And that was obviously, for the world, a hugely controversial and remarkable moment to have seen. But even within jihadi circles, even people who are very sympathetic to what Islamic State is doing, it's a very shocking thing. And again, a huge debate exists around that particular event about whether it's allowed to burn someone to death, and where Islamic scholarship sits on that as a method of retaliation or retribution under the rules of Qisas. So there's a debate around some of this, but IS never really issued anything substantive. They published a little 4-line thing online saying, yeah, we did it, and here's the principle. And they cited some very, very obscure principle which comes under, it's a branch of Qisas known as Mumathala, but they didn't explain it, they didn't attempt to go into much. So when I read that, I had really not encountered the concept of Mumathala before. I had to go back and phone some friends and start researching, almost at the risk of being flippant. What I always say is, if al-Qaeda had done that back in the day, you would have had about a 30, 40-page booklet that came out, going through it very methodically and explaining how they got to that endpoint. Now, I don't know why IS doesn't do this. You can draw your own conclusions, but they don't do this. And people have all kinds of theories. I mean, if you the most generous end, you might say it's because they believe that they have a Khalif. And if you believe in the concept of the Khilafah and having the Khalif, then you believe all executive authority and power resides in him. So provided he doesn't do something that's a clear violation of the Sharia, you go with his views and opinions, even if they're minority views and opinions, or you think that they're weak. So long as they have some jurisprudential basis, you follow them. So that may be where they're doing it and stuff. But in conclusion, what I'll say is, what I found is, as I put this book together, episodes of war or military conflict or civil disorder really provide the most galvanizing and important moments when the ideas of the Salafi-Jihadi movement mutate and they adapt. So of course Afghanistan in the 1980s is an important moment where the genesis, I think, of the modern movement really lies. You have the conflict in Algeria, of course. What happened in Saudi Arabia in the early 1990s after the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam is hugely important and profound in terms of provoking a lot of this thinking. So rather than war restricting the behavior of the actors in times of, the law constricting the behavior of actors during times of war, it's the war that changes the nature of the law itself. And it's war that changes the way these rules are interpreted and understood. And so Iraq 2003 is clearly one of the most interesting moments for that. And here's where it's particularly pertinent today. The Syrian conflict, you would expect to be changing this law again and to be interacting with it. Now we're still, it's early days, and evolution of ideas usually takes decades. But we can already see the more interesting actor in the Syrian conflict from an ideological and intellectual point of view is al-Qaeda. So it's Jabhat al-Fatah al-Sham today, or it was Jabhat al-Nusra previously. They are doing some very, very interesting things. When you look at the areas that they are administering, so it's principally around Idlib province, you have this one remarkable thing that's going on there at the moment, which is they have suspended the hudud. The hudud are the Islamic punishments that are mentioned in the Quran. It's one of three types of Islamic punishments. You have the hudud, you have qisas, and ta'zir. Now, particularly for Salafi jihadis, but Salafis in general, and really quite conservative Muslims as well, the concept of suspending the hudud or finding a way to sort of explain away the hudud is something they won't do because they say, look, it's in the Quran. So Allah gave us these. We won't be ashamed of them, right? So like chopping the hand of a thief. They say, look, we have to do this, and it's there, and that's it. And we all have heard in the past, of course, when there have been attempts by revisionist scholars to say, well, these ideas, they sort of should be updated, or so, they get condemned and usually have takfir pronounced upon them. But today, al-Qaeda has developed a theology. So there's one of their scholars who was killed not too long ago, Abu Firas, developed this idea where he said, look, you can suspend the hudud in times of calamity, in times of social disorder and strife and so on. Clearly Syria fits that definition today. And in order to do that, he went back to some of the Sahaba, so some of those people who are from the generation of the Salaf, to say, here is precedent, here is an example of times when they suspended the hudud. And it's a very interesting moment. So I refrain from saying al-Qaeda is moderating, but I say it's engaging now in a process of theological pragmatism. It's entered an era of theological pragmatism, which is very, very interesting because that pragmatism could go in one of two ways. It could lead to genuine moderation. It could also be a mechanism for something that is much more sinister, and that is this, that they are winning genuine public support. Unlike IS in Syria and Iraq, they are winning genuine public support. The areas in which Jabhat al-Fatah al-Sham is operating, they have a degree. It's not to say all Syrians love them and support them, but they are respected. And they're respected on a number of grounds, and one of them is not being brutal and being effective fighters and so on. And so this process of theological pragmatism is part of the broader effort to win hearts and minds. It's to win public support in order to have a longer term embedding within the society. And you see that as one of their own explanations for disbanding Jabhat al-Nusra, is to say we're one group that's part of the broader coalition. We are one group that sits with the Syrian people. We're not distinct from the Syrian people. We're not apart from them. We are of the people. And this program, as I say, of sort of having a sort of theological pragmatism on the ground is allowing them to demonstrate their commitment to the people. And so you may well find, and I truly believe, in fact, that they will be emerging from this conflict much more entrenched in the political landscape of Syria than a group like ISIS will, because clearly no one likes them other than their own supporters, and they're at war with practically everybody. And so they'll be overrun and defeated at some point. But this other group, Jabhat Fatah Sham, has real inroads into the community and into the society. And you could almost say that that, in and of itself, represents the ultimate triumph of Salafi Jihadism. Thank you.